She can't even see the keys. Get her away from the piano. In front of Vatican officials, a blind orphan girl is humiliated by the choir director. But when she's secretly allowed to play, something divine happens. Her music moves even the Pope to tears. What starts as a cruel dismissal spirals into a global awakening as Lucia, a child who had every reason to give up, becomes the sound the world didn't know it needed. From dusty orphanage halls to bombed-out war zones, her music brings light where there was once only silence. But the greatest miracle? She never sought fame, only to be heard. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. Get her away from the piano. This is not a playground. It's Vatican rehearsal, not a pity performance. Maestro Bellini's voice cut through the ancient stone chapel like a blade. The acoustics of the great basilica carried his fury across the vaulted ceiling, where golden cherubs looked down in stillness, as though stunned by the cruelty themselves. He marched forward, silk robe billowing, baton clenched tightly in one hand like a royal scepter of judgment. The children of the choir froze in place. Some shifted uncomfortably in their white cassocks, eyes darting between the flustered maestro and the figure seated timidly at the piano. She didn't look up. Her hands, delicate and hesitant, were already resting on the ivory keys. Lucia, 12 years old, small for her age, blind since birth, abandoned by parents whose names she had never heard. She had never once seen the sun, but she had memorized the way its warmth danced on her skin. She had never read a book, but she could feel the shape of every story hidden inside a song. Her world was not silent, it was music. And yet here she sat, her fingers hovering just above the Steinway's surface like butterflies, unsure if the petals below were real. The moment was still, suspended, sacred, until Maestro Bellini shattered it. "You think just anyone can sit at the Holy See's piano?" he barked. "You think this is some orphanage talent show?" He turned to the stunned choir. "We are preparing for His Holiness the Pope. We are preparing for history, not a blind girl's fantasy." Lucia did not flinch, her lips barely parted, her voice just a whisper. "I'm sorry, I only wanted to play. Just once." Her tone wasn't defiant, it was heartbreakingly gentle, like a child apologizing for breathing too loudly. The words hung in the air, vulnerable and bare, before crumbling under the weight of Bellini's scowl. He snapped his baton against the piano lid. The sharp crack echoed through the pews. "You have no place here," he hissed, his voice low now, as if disgust couldn't bear to be spoken aloud. "You cannot see the notes. You cannot see the conductor. You are not part of this music." Still, Lucia didn't move. Her eyes, clouded and vacant, lifted toward the light coming through the high stained glass window. She didn't need to see it. She could hear it, the way the morning light shimmered when it touched the tile floors, the way the silence held its breath when no one believed in her. That's when Sister Maria stepped forward. "She hears in ways we don't understand," the nun said softly. Her hands were clasped, trembling. "Maestro, I brought her here because I believe God speaks through this child." Bellini scoffed. "God doesn't speak through broken toys." A few gasps rustled from the children behind him. One of the older boys, Tommaso, looked down at his shoes, shame rising like heat in his cheeks. But Lucia remained silent. Not because she lacked words, but because she had already learned that silence was sometimes the only defense against cruelty. Bellini turned on his heel, commanding 2 altar servers to escort Lucia out. "Take her to the gate, she's trespassing." The girls around her shifted awkwardly, unsure if they should help or turn away. One girl, Clara, extended her hand toward Lucia, then quickly retracted it when Bellini shot her a glare. Sister Maria tried to object, but the maestro's authority here was absolute. As Lucia was led away, the children fell back into rehearsed posture, yet something had cracked open in that sacred place. A tremble in the marble, a shame in their echo. Later, in the cloisters behind the basilica, Sister Maria found Lucia sitting alone beside a fountain, hands folded in her lap. "I shouldn't have tried," Lucia whispered. The nun sat beside her, gently taking her hands. "You did nothing wrong. In fact, you reminded us all of what sacred music really is." Lucia shook her head. "He's right. I can't see the conductor. I can't see the notes. But you can feel them, and feeling is what the world has forgotten." The wind stirred the trees above them. A pigeon flapped its wings overhead. Lucia tilted her head as if listening to a hidden harmony in the air. "Sometimes," she said, "when I sit at the keys, I forget I'm different. I hear things that make me whole." Sister Maria smiled, though her eyes welled with tears. "Then you must play again." "But he banned me." "Then we'll play when no one's watching." That night, long after the candles in the basilica had burned to stubs and the echoes of the day's choir rehearsal had faded into sleep, Lucia and Sister Maria crept back into the chapel. The great doors groaned softly as they opened. The silence inside was like a velvet curtain, thick and dignified. Lucia approached the Steinway once more. This time there was no crowd, no scoffs, no baton snapping shut, just her and the keys. Her hands floated above them for a breathless moment. Then, as if some unseen thread had been plucked deep in her soul, she began to play. At first, just a few notes, then a phrase, then a story. It wasn't a song anyone had taught her. It was something she had heard in the rustling of Sister Maria's rosary beads, in the shiver of candlelight, in the breath between a sigh and a prayer. It was the melody of loneliness turning into longing, of longing turning into light. And up in the shadows of the high choir loft, hidden behind a lattice screen, a man stood still, listening. He had arrived early for his official visit, a Vatican emissary sent ahead to oversee preparations and protocols. But what he found that night was not protocol. It was something sacred. He did not move, did not speak. Only listened, hand clasped to his chest, eyes blurred with tears. When the last note faded into silence, Lucia sat still, unsure if anyone had heard. But the man had already left quietly, with a message that would reach the Pope's desk by morning. The next morning broke with the hush of reverence hanging over Vatican Square. The early sunlight spilled in golden shafts through the colonnades, warming the stone beneath pilgrims' feet. Cardinals and attendants moved like a ballet of crimson and white across the marble floors, preparing for what would soon be one of the most important events of the year, an official papal concert, welcoming dignitaries from across Europe. But for Maestro Bellini, the morning did not begin with music. It began with a summons. He arrived at the ornate receiving hall promptly, his robe straight, his expression polished, as always. But his steps faltered slightly when he saw who was waiting for him. Monsignor Aldrovandi, the Pope's most trusted advisor, his face unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back as he stood beneath a tapestry of the Virgin Mary. "Maestro," Aldrovandi said quietly, his voice like parchment touched by fire. "There's been a request." Bellini blinked. "A request, Your Excellency?" The Monsignor took a step forward. "His Holiness has heard of the blind girl, the orphan." Bellini's stomach tightened, but he kept his tone even. "Lucia is not part of the official ensemble. She was trespassing, uninvited and unsanctioned. And yet, someone heard her last night, someone who weeps rarely, someone who does not weep unless heaven itself moves him." The Monsignor narrowed his eyes. "The Pope wants to hear her." There was a long pause. Bellini's mouth opened, then closed. He tried to gather his thoughts, but they scattered like pages in a storm. He had silenced that girl, pushed her into shadow, and now that shadow had become a light too bright to control. "She's not trained," he said, carefully measured. "She plays from instinct, not discipline. She cannot see the score. She cannot even see the keys." Aldrovandi's brow rose. Perhaps that's why her music reached where others failed. Bellini felt his heart skip, then harden. "I will arrange an audition," he said through a forced smile, "privately, to demonstrate her limitations." "No," the Monsignor replied. "You will grant her the respect due any performer. Let her play, without obstruction, and let His Holiness decide what is worthy." The words were final. Bellini bowed, but when he rose again, his eyes no longer gleamed with certainty. They burned with something darker. Hours later, Sister Maria found Lucia beneath the olive trees in the cloister garden, fingers tracing the etched pattern on a discarded hymn book. She looked up when she heard the soft crunch of footsteps. "They told me," Maria said gently. "The Pope wants to hear you play." Lucia blinked, her face unmoving. "He knows who I am?" "Yes, child, and he's asked for you." Lucia's lips trembled. She turned her face slightly toward the warmth of the sun. "But why would he want to hear me?" "Because heaven isn't blind to beauty," Maria whispered, "even when men are." That afternoon, under Bellini's careful orchestration, Lucia was invited to the chapel again. But this time, it wasn't the grand Steinway she found waiting. It was an old, battered upright piano wheeled in from a dusty storage room. The keys were stiff, several were chipped, one didn't sound at all. Lucia reached out and touched them. "You'll play on this," Bellini said, his arms crossed, his voice sweetened with false kindness. "Let's not overwhelm the child with too much pressure." Lucia said nothing. She had learned the shape of this tone, condescension wrapped in velvet. She bowed her head and placed her fingers gently on the keys. And then she played. Not to impress, not to prove anything. She played to remember. The melody that came was different this time, slower, deeper. It carried the ache of a child who had never known her mother's voice. The prayer of someone who had learned to imagine what stars looked like by listening to the way night sounded. The music filled the room not with force, but with truth. When it ended, the silence was so complete, it made the windows seem frozen in time. Lucia sat motionless. Bellini gave a tight nod. "Adequate," he said, turning to the Monsignor, "but certainly not fit for public display." But Aldrovandi didn't answer. He was still staring at Lucia. "She plays like someone who's already been in heaven," he said softly. Words spread. Whispers turned to ripples. Ripples turned to waves. By the next day, the children in the choir were buzzing with questions. Tommaso, the boy who once laughed when Bellini mocked her, now sat beside Lucia at lunch. Clara offered her a ribbon for her hair. The other girls no longer stared. They listened, and yet Bellini was not done. On the morning of the concert, as trumpets were being tuned and rows of marble pews were filling with nobility and clergy, he made one final attempt. "She's not in the program," he insisted to Aldrovandi. "Her presence could be distracting. It undermines months of rehearsed perfection." The Monsignor gave a small smile. "Then perhaps it is time we welcomed something imperfect that can move us to perfection." Bellini's mouth tightened. "She will fail." Or perhaps, came a new voice behind them, "she will remind us of grace." They turned. The Pope stood in the threshold, no fanfare, no guards, just the man in white robes, ancient yet strong, his eyes filled with something ancient, joy touched by sorrow. He smiled gently at Bellini, then stepped toward the piano where Lucia waited, sitting quietly, hands folded in her lap. She did not know he was near until he spoke. "My child," he said, kneeling beside her, "I have heard your music, and it was not from earth." Lucia tilted her head. "I only play what I feel. I'm sorry if it's not, right?" The Pope chuckled softly. "Right? Who told you that beauty must be perfect to be holy?" She hesitated. "People say I don't belong here." He took her hand. "Then let me say this so heaven hears it too. You are exactly where God meant you to be." He stood, turned to the crowd now gathering, and spoke again, louder for all to hear. "Let the blind girl play. Today, she teaches us how to see." The room fell into a reverent hush. Bellini, frozen, stared as Lucia was led to the Steinway, this time polished and open, its lid lifted like a stage curtain ready to reveal something divine. Lucia sat. Her fingers hovered once more. And then she played. Her fingers rested on the keys as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. The world around her had gone utterly still. The murmuring audience, the rustling of velvet garments, even the quiet clink of golden rings against rosary beads, all of it was silenced by the weight of what was about to happen. The basilica held its breath. Lucia tilted her head slightly upward, though her clouded eyes could not see the vaulted ceilings or the carved saints watching over her. What she saw, what she always saw, was within. A world shaped by sound and memory, where pain and wonder were braided into melody. Her first note was like a whisper in a cathedral, soft, trembling human. Then she played the next, and the next. Each one flowed with a quiet authority that did not demand attention, but earned it. The music began to climb like light rising through stained glass. The chords, delicate at first, wove into one another like silk, like prayer, like the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime listening in the dark. The Pope sat unmoving in the front row, his hands folded, head bowed, not in critique, but in reverence. The cardinals behind him leaned forward slowly, their faces transformed from skepticism to awe. Even the young choir children standing at attention along the apse wall could not look away. Lucia's music had no name. It did not belong to any composer, nor did it follow the rigid rules of counterpoint or fugue. It was a story, a living, breathing memory she poured into the keys. The story of a little girl abandoned at birth, of years spent hearing joy from behind closed doors, of learning the world by touch and echo, and of the one moment, this moment, where she was finally allowed to speak, not with words, but with truth. It was not a performance, it was a confession. And the cathedral, every soul within it, listened as though heaven had cracked open. Even the skeptics felt it. One of the senior bishops, a man known for his stoic disapproval, slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. A noble woman in a fur-trimmed coat reached for her husband's hand and squeezed it without a word. The young altar boy crossed himself, though no one had told him to. Lucia did not see their faces, but she felt their hearts, because her own heart was wide open. Her hands moved without hesitation now. They danced, they wept, they soared. The melody shifted from sorrow to wonder to something transcendent, a joy so fragile it felt like glass, and yet so powerful it made the ancient walls ring. Then, gently, like a candle flickering to its final breath, the music faded. The last note floated for a moment in the air, suspended like a final blessing before falling into silence. No one moved. The hush was not from shock. It was reverence, a sacred stillness, as if even the saints in the stained glass had paused to listen. And then, applause did not erupt. It unfolded. It began slowly, hesitantly, until it swelled into a storm of clapping, a standing ovation that echoed against marble and gold. Chairs scraped backward. People rose to their feet. Some cheered. Others simply stood with hands pressed over their hearts, too moved to do anything else. The Pope rose slowly. He walked, unhurried but purposeful, toward Lucia, who sat still at the bench, not knowing if the silence that followed her last note had been one of acceptance or rejection. She flinched slightly when she heard his voice near. "My child," he said softly, kneeling beside her once more, "your music was not played by hands, but by heaven." Lucia turned her face toward the sound. "I didn't know if they would listen," she whispered. The Pope smiled. Not only did they listen, they heard. Then, with both hands, he turned to the audience and raised his voice. "This girl, this blind girl, sees what we forget. She hears the voice of God not with her eyes, but with her soul. And today she reminded us that music is not a performance. It is a bridge between brokenness and grace." Lucia's lips trembled. She bowed her head. The Pope turned back to her. "You are a gift from heaven." The audience erupted again, only now some were weeping openly. Children clapped with wonder. Even Bellini, standing rigid in the shadows of the side aisle, looked pale and motionless, his polished mask shattered by something he could not control. Truth. His authority, once unquestioned, had dissolved in the sound of a blind girl's hands. No one was looking at him now. They were looking at her. Later, as the ceremony ended and the dignitaries began to depart, the Pope called Sister Maria forward. "You," he said gently, "have the eyes of faith. When others saw a burden, you saw a blessing." Sister Maria bowed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. And then, turning back to the congregation, the Pope made a quiet decree. "She will be offered full scholarship to the Vatican Conservatory, and her place here is no longer in question. It is ordained." Lucia stood uncertainly beside him as the crowd bowed, clapped, and whispered her name like a litany. In that moment she felt the warmth of the sun again, but this time not just on her skin. It was within her. Something had changed, not only in her, but in them. And somewhere in the crowd, a boy from the children's choir walked forward. Tommaso, the same boy who had once laughed when Bellini mocked her. He stepped beside her now. "Would you teach me that song?" he asked softly. Lucia turned toward his voice, and for the first time smiled fully. "I don't know if I can. I only remember how it felt." "Then show me how it felt," he whispered. And she nodded, because now she belonged. It was the way the silence lingered in the walls that made it clear the moment had left something behind. Long after the basilica had emptied, long after the echo of applause had faded, and even the golden candlelight had dimmed, something holy remained in the air, like the scent of incense that clings to robes even after the procession has passed. Lucia stood with her fingertips resting gently on the edge of the piano bench, as if trying to absorb the memory through touch. The keys had gone still. The room had returned to its solemn stillness, but her heartbeat had not. She didn't need to see the marble columns or the shimmering glass above to know what had just happened. She could feel it in her skin, in the warmth that still pulsed from the Pope's words, in the awe-struck hush of the crowd. For the first time in her life, the world had truly listened. Not to pity her, not to fix her, but to hear her. And that was everything. Sister Maria returned to her side, breathless from emotion, arms trembling with the weight of what they had just witnessed. She said nothing at first, only took Lucia's hands and held them in her own. In that grip was 1,000 things: pride, protection, prayer. "They won't forget today," the nun finally whispered. Lucia shook her head gently. "I won't either." But just beyond the veil of applause and wonder, something darker stirred. Maestro Bellini stood at the far end of the corridor outside the chapel, his shadow stretching long across the polished floor like a wound. His face was still, too still. His eyes, once sharp and imperious, now held something cold and unreadable. He had been erased in the span of a melody. His authority, his name, his legacy even, had been brushed aside by a girl who couldn't see his glare or feel the weight of his titles. And worst of all, she hadn't even tried to humiliate him. She had simply played and won. He stood there watching as the papal aides ushered Lucia gently down the hall, as Sister Maria glowed with a kind of vindication that years of quiet faithfulness had never dared expect. Bellini didn't follow. He simply turned away and disappeared into the darkness of the vestry, his footsteps swallowed by the ancient stones beneath. But in the days that followed, his name would fall like a crumbling statue. The Vatican Conservatory issued an official statement, citing misconduct and spiritually negligent conduct toward a minor of exceptional potential. Several of the choir parents came forward to describe previous instances where Bellini had degraded other children, none of whom had the power to be heard until now. Lucia's music had not just opened hearts. It had opened doors long sealed shut by fear. And she, without lifting a single finger in malice, had changed everything. At the orphanage, the younger children crowded around her now. Where once she was the quiet girl who sat alone in corners with her broken keyboard, she was now their light. They asked her to play at bedtime. They drew pictures of her with halos and flowers and giant grand pianos floating in the sky. One morning, Clara, one of the choir girls who had once been too scared to speak up, arrived at the orphanage with a small wrapped box. "I asked my parents," she said shyly, "and they said we could give this to you." Lucia opened the lid carefully. Inside was a metronome made of rosewood, gently polished, with her initials carved into the base, LV. Lucia ran her fingers over the engraving and smiled. "I've never owned anything like this." Clara shrugged. "I think it's time the world started giving back to you." Word of her performance spread far beyond Rome. News outlets broadcast clips of her playing. Journalists called it the miracle concert. Some questioned if it had been orchestrated. Others debated if the Pope's declaration had political undertones. But no one could deny what they heard. Musicians from across the world sent letters. Some offered to mentor her. Others simply thanked her. A world-class pianist wrote, "In one piece, you did what years of training could not. Remind me why I fell in love with music." Even the children in the Vatican choir changed. Rehearsals sounded different now. The precision remained, but something had shifted in the tone, in the way they watched each other, supported each other. Bellini had demanded obedience, Lucia had inspired harmony, and then came the moment that would tie it all together. An invitation, official and sealed with gold. Lucia was asked to perform once again, this time at the Easter Vigil Mass, the most sacred liturgy of the Catholic calendar. This wasn't a concert. This was prayer in its purest form. Sister Maria held the letter close to her chest when she read it aloud, her voice breaking. "You've gone from outcast to centerpiece." Lucia didn't say anything for a long time. Then finally, she whispered, "Can I play the same song?" Maria smiled. "You can play anything you want." Lucia's smile faltered. "But what if I can't feel it again? What if it was just that one day?" The nun knelt beside her. "You don't need to feel what you felt then. You just need to be who you are now." The night of the vigil, the basilica was dark, lit only by 1,000 flickering candles. The congregation waited in reverent anticipation. The choir had finished its final hymn, and silence fell once more. And then, without introduction, Lucia was led to the piano. She wore a simple white dress, no medals, no ribbons, just humility wrapped in light. She sat, she breathed. And then, instead of beginning with a dramatic crescendo or rehearsed anthem, she did something unexpected. She began to play silence. Her fingers hovered, then tapped, barely a whisper. The notes that followed were almost too soft to hear. It was as if she were inviting the congregation into her world, not commanding them to listen, but gently opening a door to stillness. From there, the music blossomed. No longer the story of pain, but of peace. It was no longer about proving anything. It was about offering everything, a reflection, a thank you, a kind of musical Eucharist. And when she finished, there was no applause, only stillness. And in that stillness, awe. The Pope stood, and with trembling words he said what no one could have imagined only weeks ago. She is not a guest here. She is the sound of this church. And that night, as Lucia walked slowly back down the candlelit aisle, the children of the choir stood one by one and began to sing her song. They hadn't been taught the melody. They had simply remembered it. Because once heaven speaks, it doesn't go unheard. Rain fell the next morning, not the heavy weeping kind, but a gentle, rhythmic drizzle, like the sky was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The stone courtyards of the Vatican glistened under the gray dawn, and the olive trees in the garden bowed slightly with the weight of moisture. Inside the orphanage, the children still spoke in hushed tones, as though the echoes of the night's sacred performance hadn't quite faded from their ears. They clutched candle stubs from the vigil, treating them like holy relics. The nuns, normally busy with breakfast or discipline, paused to look at Lucia as she passed. No longer just as their blind girl, but as something luminous, like a flame that had chosen not to flicker out. Lucia sat alone in the corner of the chapel, her small keyboard on her lap, worn and scratched, keys sometimes sticking. She didn't press a single note. She simply ran her fingers across it, feeling the shape of the silence between each one. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. Silence used to be the space where abandonment lived. Now it was the prelude to miracles. The door creaked behind her. Sister Maria stepped in, holding a letter. Her hands trembled slightly. "It's from the Pontifical Academy," she said softly. "They want you to record a special album for children who are blind, for orphans, for those who think God forgot how to listen." Lucia turned her head toward the voice, blinking slowly. An album? The word felt strange on her tongue. She had never owned a CD, never heard her own playing played back to her. Her world was made of the moment, of one sound fading into the next, never preserved, never repeated. Maria nodded. "They want you to choose the pieces. They want it to be yours." Lucia's fingers curled slightly on the keys. "What if I don't know how to play what they want to hear?" "You've never played what people expected," Maria smiled, "and that's why the world can finally hear again." The proposal wasn't just a request, it was a revolution. For generations, the Pontifical Academy had curated recordings from Europe's most elite conservatories. Each album polished, perfected, clinical in its excellence. But this time, they wanted soul. They wanted Lucia. The Vatican's music hall, usually reserved for papal addresses and curated symphonies, was offered to her alone for the recording. No audience, no producers. Just Lucia, the same battered keyboard by her side, and a freshly tuned Steinway standing like an altar in the center of the stage. As she approached the piano, guided gently by a young assistant named Pietro, she paused, tilting her head to the right. "There's a chandelier above us," she said. Pietro blinked. "How did you know?" "I can hear it," she whispered, "the way the air bends around its shape." He watched her in stunned silence as she sat at the piano and placed her hands gently on the keys. This time, she began with something no one expected, a lullaby. Simple, slow, the kind that doesn't try to impress but wraps itself around the heart like a memory. It was a song her birth mother never sang, a song Lucia had always longed to hear. And she wrote it now, in real time, for all the children who ever pressed their ears to the walls of a world that didn't answer. She played lullabies, then hymns, then notes of unspoken grief braided with healing. Some she played with both hands, others with just one. A few pieces didn't even have names. One was just a soundscape of shadows and stars. Over the course of 2 days, she recorded 12 tracks. Each was different. Each was sacred. By the time the final note was captured, the sound technicians no longer hid behind their booths. They stood at the doorway of the hall, hats in their hands, eyes red-rimmed, listening like parishioners in a silent mass. When she finished, Lucia turned her head toward the empty rows of velvet chairs and said, "Can I give it to the children first, before the rest of the world?" Maria nodded from behind her. "Of course, they were your first audience." The album was named Felt, Not Seen. And within a week, it had traveled further than any of them imagined. Blind schools across Europe received copies. Orphanages from Poland to Peru began playing it at sunrise and before bed. A little boy in Nigeria, also blind from birth, sent a recording of himself trying to mimic her melody on an old harmonica. In Seoul, a child's cancer ward replaced their morning alarm with her lullaby. In São Paulo, a street musician used her song to calm children fleeing violence. And yet Lucia stayed quiet in the storm of praise. She did not chase the spotlight. She asked for no title. She still played barefoot. She still tuned her keyboard by touch. She still listened more than she spoke. And that's what made her unforgettable. Then came a letter, hand-delivered, from the Pope himself. Lucia held the envelope carefully as Maria read aloud, "My child, you have given the Church something beyond gold or marble. You have reminded us that miracles are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive as music only the broken can understand. I would be honored if you would play once more, this time for the leaders of the world." It was the United Nations Spiritual Summit, a gathering of leaders not of faiths, but of hearts. The Pope would speak, but he wanted her to open the summit. Lucia bowed her head. "I'm scared," she whispered. Maria knelt beside her. "You weren't afraid of the darkness. Don't be afraid of the light either." In Geneva, the hall was unlike anything she'd seen, though she hadn't seen it, not really. But she felt the buzz in the air. She heard the dozens of languages echoing off stone. She heard hearts beating faster than usual. She felt the vibration of a planet waiting for something to believe in. And then she played. No flash, no fanfare. Just a girl, with her hands on the keys, and the courage to be heard. The silence before her first note was unlike any other. Not the hush of reverence in a cathedral, nor the expectant pause of a concert hall. This was the breathless, watchful quiet of a world divided. Leaders from rival nations seated under one domed ceiling, flanked by flags and translators, faces carved by policy and posturing. They had come to speak of peace, but most had already begun drafting rebuttals. Until she walked in. Lucia's entrance was gentle, almost too soft to notice at first. No grand announcement, no spotlight. Just a young girl in a cream dress, led by the hand across the polished floor by a man in a plain suit. The only color on her was a single blue ribbon tied loosely around her wrist, a gift from a little girl at the orphanage pressed into her palm the night before and whispered, "For courage." She stepped up to the piano, another Steinway, grand and gleaming beneath the chandeliers of Geneva's Grand Assembly Chamber. Her fingers brushed the keys like a blind woman learning a lover's face, gentle and certain. She could feel the room before she heard it. The stillness, the tension. And then she played. One note, soft, then another and another. The melody was not bold or urgent. It didn't beg attention. It earned it. It crept into the room like light under a locked door. She played a song, not of triumph, but of longing. The kind of music that sounded like a child watching two people argue in a language they don't understand. The song of someone who doesn't want to win, only to be seen. It wasn't composed to impress. It was offered to disarm. And one by one, the walls began to crumble. A woman from the Japanese delegation lowered her translation headset and closed her eyes. A Middle Eastern ambassador, whose face had not softened in hours, leaned back and let out a slow, unguarded sigh. A South American leader wiped his glasses and didn't bother putting them back on. It was not a song that tried to be everything. It was a song that tried to be honest. And that, in this room of practiced performance and choreographed diplomacy, was more radical than any speech. As Lucia continued, the tempo slowed. The melody shifted. It became a lullaby again, but this time not for children, for nations, for old warriors who had forgotten the sound of forgiveness, for tired men who'd built walls out of fear and couldn't remember how to climb down. She played for them, not against them. And when the final note faded into the golden dome above, there was no applause. No movement. Just silence. Not empty silence, but full of realization, of disarmed egos, of something deeply human rediscovered. Lucia turned her face toward the crowd. She could not see their tears. but she felt them. In the stillness that followed, the Pope stood. No speech, no ceremony, only a nod. And that was all the summit needed to begin. In the days that followed, something shifted. 3 ministers from countries on the brink of conflict agreed to stay an extra night. 2 rival delegates who had not spoken in years were seen walking together after dusk, not debating, but listening. The summit was declared an emotional turning point, and newspapers across the world published headlines not about tension, but about tenderness. The blind pianist who changed the tone. Lucia's melody softens nations. The girl who taught diplomats to feel. Back in Rome, the orphanage children gathered around the television, watching the playback in black and white. One of them whispered, "She's like a whisper that makes thunder go quiet." And no one disagreed. Lucia, however, returned to her little room behind the chapel. There were flowers now, letters, a growing stack of postcards from children all over the world. But she remained grounded. Not because someone told her to be, but because she still played the same battered keyboard each night. Still ran her fingers across the notes, not to impress, but to understand. One evening, Sister Maria found her alone, playing nothing, just sitting with her hands on the keys. "You haven't touched the new piano," Maria said, nodding to the untouched grand model gifted by a benefactor. Lucia tilted her head. "It's too perfect. I like the one that remembers my mistakes." Maria sat beside her. "Do you know what they're calling you now?" Lucia smiled softly. "The Pope's little miracle?" Maria chuckled. "That. And also the saint of sound." Lucia turned her face upward. "I'm not a saint." "No," Maria said gently. "You're something more dangerous." Lucia waited. "You're someone who believes." Days passed, then weeks. Lucia's recordings continued to ripple across the world. Her music became a fixture in hospitals, refugee camps, prayer rooms, meditation centers, even prisons. People who had never heard a note of classical music sat in silence, letting her songs wash over them. They didn't care that she couldn't read sheet music. She made them feel something no textbook could define. And one day the letter came. A child in Syria, 10 years old. No name, only a scribbled drawing, a picture of a small girl sitting at a piano surrounded by rubble. And underneath in Arabic, "Even when bombs fall, I play you in my head. You are my safe place." Lucia held the letter in her hands for a long time. Then she walked to her keyboard and played. Not for a summit, not for the Pope, not for applause, but for one child in one forgotten place who needed to believe that music could still survive the war. And in that room, lit only by a single candle, Lucia played until the night itself fell asleep. The candle on her windowsill had burned low, flickering softly against the ancient stone. The flame danced as if trying to echo her music, though it could not compete. Lucia sat still, her fingers lingering on the final chord like a prayer that didn't want to end. The last note hung in the air, not fully gone, not fully here, like memory itself. The Syrian child's drawing lay beside her. Crude pencil strokes, a crumbling piano drawn with ash-colored lines. A small figure, head turned upward toward nothing, and yet somehow toward everything. The image had no perspective, no scale, but it didn't need either. It had something more potent than realism. It had hope. Lucia pressed her hand gently to the paper. Her fingers found the smudged edges, the creases. She could not see it, but she knew it by touch now. Every corner, every line. In the quiet, she began to whisper the melody she had just played, as if sending it to the child on the wind. And somehow, she believed it would reach them. She always had. The next morning she made a request, not to perform, not to record, but to travel. It startled even Sister Maria. "To where?" she asked gently. "To the children," Lucia replied simply. "The ones who don't have music, the ones who hear bombs more than bells." Maria hesitated. "It could be dangerous. They'll say it's unwise." "They already said I shouldn't play," Lucia answered, tilting her face toward the morning light. And they were wrong. Word reached the Pope within days, and to the surprise of many he agreed. "Let her go," he said softly, eyes glinting with something both solemn and joyful. "Let her be the hymn that travels where choirs cannot." Within a week, preparations were made. Not lavish. Lucia didn't want ceremony, no motorcades, no red carpets, just a small team of volunteers, a well-worn upright piano mounted on a reinforced trailer, and a guide named Gabriel, who knew the refugee corridors better than anyone. He was a quiet man, ex-military, now a teacher, who said little but carried every note Lucia played like it was sacred cargo. They began their journey in silence, winding through the outskirts of southern Italy into Greece, across the islands that caught so many fleeing feet. At each stop, Lucia performed without a stage, under canvas tents in dusty courtyards on the cracked floors of abandoned churches. She didn't need an audience. She needed only a child within earshot. And they came. At first, shyly, watching from shadows, then, step by step, closer, barefoot, wide-eyed, clinging to scraps of clothing and pieces of memory. Some had never heard a piano. Others had forgotten the sound of peace. But all of them leaned forward when she played. She never began with an announcement, never introduced herself. She would simply sit, feel the breeze, and begin. A girl in Lesbos wept through the entire second song, clutching a teddy bear with one eye. In a Bulgarian border camp, two boys began to hum along, then harmonize, their voices cracking like old wood. In Hungary, an elderly woman, displaced and alone, touched Lucia's face and whispered in broken Italian, "I haven't felt young in 60 years, until now." Lucia smiled. She didn't need to see their faces to recognize what she had awakened in them. It was the same thing she had always longed for herself, to be heard, not fixed. In Serbia, they played inside the ruins of a monastery whose roof had been blown off. The sunlight poured through the skeleton of rafters, golden beams falling across her hands as she played. Pigeons fluttered overhead. The children sat on what remained of pews, heads resting against one another's shoulders. There, she played the Syrian boy's lullaby again. Slower this time, the notes falling like feathers. And just as the final chord faded, one of the children, a girl with hair tied back and scraps of ribbon, stepped forward and held up a drawing. Another sketch, another broken piano, but this time it was surrounded by people, faces, music notes flying upward like birds, and Lucia sitting at the center. When Sister Maria took the paper from the girl's trembling hand, she saw something scrawled in Arabic across the bottom. "When you play, we feel less alone." That night, Lucia didn't sleep. She sat by the campfire, barefoot in the sand, listening to the waves crash softly beyond the trees. Gabriel kept watch nearby, silently tuning the cracked wood on the side of the trailer. A few volunteers passed quietly with blankets and whispered prayers. Lucia rested her head against the side of the piano and listened. Not to the sea, not to the fire, but to the space inside herself where music always began. "I'm not tired," she whispered. Maria looked over. "I know. It's just, the world is so loud," Lucia said, "and I don't think it knows how to listen to itself anymore." Maria walked to her and knelt down. "Maybe that's why God made you silent first, so that when you finally spoke, the world would have no choice but to stop and hear you." Lucia's lips parted, then curled into a soft, grateful smile. And then, just as a breeze swept through the camp, rustling tents and turning candle flames sideways, Lucia whispered, "There's one more place I want to play." "Where?" Maria asked. "Where no one ever plays." 2 days later, under special escort and tight security, the small caravan made its way toward the edge of a conflict zone. A border village long abandoned, where silence reigned not from reverence, but from fear. There were no crowds here. No stage, no reporters, just the shells of homes and the broken skeleton of a bombed-out school. Lucia stepped down from the trailer slowly. The dust crunched beneath her feet. Her hand touched the side of the piano, steadying herself. "They used to have music here," Gabriel said softly. Lucia nodded. "They still do. It's just waiting." The piano was rolled into the school's collapsed courtyard. A few children, those still too young to understand the danger of hope, peeked from behind a crumbling wall. Lucia sat. The sun was beginning to set. The light painted her face in amber and gold. And for the first time since her journey began, she played not softly, but with power. With defiance. Not angry, not aggressive, but bold. She played a song that rose like a cathedral from rubble, like a voice that would not be buried under dust or silence. A song of resistance without violence, of light that refused to flicker out. It wasn't sweet, it was strong. She played until the air itself shimmered. And when the final note came, so sharp and clear it rang through the ruins like a bell, Lucia stood. Not to bow, not to leave, but to listen. And in the stillness, a small voice echoed from the rubble. "I heard you." A boy, thin, dirt on his cheeks, standing alone. Lucia turned her face toward the sound. Did it help? she asked. He nodded. I think it made the ground remember it was home. Lucia's smile trembled, and then she whispered, "Mine too." The wind shifted as dusk fell, brushing Lucia's face like the hand of something ancient and unseen. She stood still in the broken courtyard, the piano behind her, echoing with silence, the kind that doesn't feel empty, but full. The boy's words repeated gently in her mind. I think it made the ground remember it was home. She reached for the crumbled wall beside her, letting her fingers explore its chipped texture. Dust clung to her skin, as if the ruins themselves were trying to hold her there, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. Sister Maria watched from a distance, hands clasped together as though in silent prayer, her eyes never leaving Lucia, who had once been the orphan child no one noticed, and now stood as if she were part of the very land. Gabriel approached carefully, his footsteps deliberate on fractured stone. We need to move before nightfall. This place changes when the light's gone. Lucia nodded faintly but didn't move yet. I want to remember this sound. What sound? He asked. This silence. It's different from the others. It's forgiving. Maria stepped forward, gently wrapping a shawl over Lucia's shoulders. Even silence bows to grace. As they began packing the piano onto the trailer, children emerged from shadowed corners, barefoot, cautious, but drawn. One by one they approached the piano as if it were a relic, brushing their fingers across its lid, standing on tiptoe to peer at the keys. Lucia didn't stop them. She stepped aside, smiling softly as one of the smallest boys banged 2 notes clumsily, then looked around in wide-eyed awe as they echoed into the ruins. They've never touched a piano, Maria whispered. They don't need lessons, Lucia said. They just need permission. It was then that a little girl, barely older than 5, walked forward with a crumpled flower in her hand. Petals torn, stem bent, she placed it carefully on the piano keys. For you, she said in broken Italian. Because your music is like sky. Lucia's hand trembled as she reached forward and touched the petals. She imagined the color in her mind, perhaps red or blue or something impossible. She didn't need to see it. She had heard its shape in the girl's voice. Later, as the trailer rumbled away from the ruins, Lucia leaned against the window of the van, listening to the road, to the rustle of Maria's rosary beside her, to the quiet breathing of children who had been allowed to come with them for the next stop. She could still hear the melody she played, but more than that she heard something else. She heard what wasn't broken anymore. They returned to Rome weeks later. Lucia's arrival wasn't marked by cameras or fanfare. No parades, no headlines, just a silent welcome by the Pope himself, who met her in the garden beneath the fig trees with tears in his eyes and only 2 words, "Thank you." She didn't need more. She never had. At her request, the piano she played in the ruins was placed in a small, open-air chapel that overlooked the orphanage's garden. Not behind velvet ropes, not in a museum. Just beneath the sky, for any child to touch. She returned to the orphanage quietly, slipping back into her old routines. The children didn't treat her like a saint or a celebrity. They pulled her hand when they wanted to play tag. They asked her to help find missing socks. They piled into her lap while she tried to eat, all talking at once, and Lucia laughed. Not the poised, gentle smile she gave at galas or summits, but full laughter, loud and unrestrained, the kind that makes people stop what they're doing and smile without realizing it. Still, change had followed her home. A few weeks later, the Vatican invited her to take up residence within its musical conservatory, not as a student, but as an honorary fellow. Not to study, but to share. She was hesitant at first. "I don't know how to teach," she said. "But you know how to show us," the cardinal replied. "And that's rarer." She agreed, on one condition: no more auditions. They laughed, but she meant it. She had lived through the weight of being judged before playing a single note. She had walked into rooms where her blindness was seen before her being. She would not participate in perpetuating that for others. The conservatory accepted, and for the first time in its centuries-old history, it opened a division called the School of Sound Without Sight. Lucia taught by feel, not instruction. She taught children how to play rain on a piano, how to speak grief through a single key, how to wait between notes until silence told you the next one. One day, Maestro Bellini returned, not in robes, not with titles. He came quietly, anonymously, to one of her workshops for displaced youth. He sat in the back listening, He never introduced himself. Lucia knew anyway. When the children had gone, he approached her, voice hoarse. "I wanted to say something," he said, "but words feel very small now." Lucia tilted her head. "They usually are." He gave a broken smile. "I was wrong about you." "No," she said gently. "You were wrong about yourself." He paused, then nodded. "You gave them something I never could." Lucia turned toward the piano. "I just played what I needed to hear." And as he left, for the first time in his long, decorated life, Bellini did not feel grand. He felt grateful. Time passed. Lucia's name spread further. Her music became part of healing programs. It was used in therapy, in reconciliation talks between nations, in the private headphones of those trying to sleep through pain. But she never chased glory. She returned always to where she began, the small, quiet places, in the orphanage chapel, in gardens, in ruins, in the hearts of children who didn't know if the world would ever hear them. And in all those places she played the same message again and again. You are not forgotten. You are not broken. You are music. Spring returned to Rome like a sigh of relief, warm, slow, and fragrant. The olive trees in the courtyard swayed with new leaves, and sunlight slipped through the chapel windows in golden threads, resting gently on the cracked tiles where Lucia often sat. She still played every day, though never for an audience. The piano in the open-air chapel was no longer just an instrument. It had become a companion. Its keys had been worn smooth by her hands, each one holding a secret, a story, a song that only she knew how to tell. The children came and went freely now, no longer afraid to sit beside her, to press a note, to ask what it meant. Lucia never explained with words. She'd answer with another note, or with silence, or with a smile that said, "You already know, don't you?" She didn't teach music the way conservatories wanted. She didn't separate the scales from the soul. She let each child stumble until their hands remembered something their minds had forgotten. That was the miracle. That memory could exist in the fingers before the tongue. One morning, as the bells of St. Peter's began to chime, a knock echoed through the orphanage gate. Gabriel had returned. He stood taller, calmer, though the wear of distant travel still lingered in the lines beneath his eyes. He didn't speak right away. He simply handed Lucia a letter, its seal marked not in gold, but in a simple blue wax like the ribbon she still wore. Lucia sat under the fig tree to listen as Sister Maria read the words aloud. "Dearest Lucia, you may not know my name, but you have changed my life. I was the boy who heard your music in the ruins. I was the one who said the ground remembered it was home. That day I realized something I had never been told, that the world does not need to be whole for it to be beautiful. I have found a home now, in a new place, but I carry your music with me. I play it when I am afraid. I play it for others who are learning how to hope. I don't know what the future holds, but I know your song is part of it. Thank you for finding us. Love, Samir." Lucia's breath caught in her throat. She placed her palm flat against the paper, tracing the words and then the edges, as if memorizing its shape. "Samir," she repeated, almost in reverence. "He found his way." Gabriel sat beside her. "Because you gave him a map, one made of sound." That evening, the sky over the city turned rose gold. A soft wind lifted the smell of bread and basil from nearby kitchens, and for a moment, all felt tender and alive. Lucia sat at the piano again, this time with a single candle beside her. She began to play. Not one of her past pieces, not the lullaby or the song from the summit, but something entirely new. A melody built not from sorrow but from remembering, the kind of song that grows only when a wound has turned to wisdom. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately. She was not trying to move hearts this time. She was playing to honor them. To honor Samir. To honor the children who never got to write letters. To honor the silence that still echoed in the walls of rooms destroyed by war, by poverty, by ignorance. Each note was a thread, weaving them back together. Across the courtyard, a crowd had quietly gathered. Nuns, children, visitors, even a few tourists who had been drawn not by signs or schedules, but by the pull of something gentle and mysterious. And at the edge of that gathering stood a figure in white, the Pope. He said nothing. He simply stood in the shadows of the fig tree, hands folded, watching a girl who could not see him, but who had, in truth, seen him more clearly than most. When she finished, the final note lingered like perfume on the air, and then was gone. Lucia lowered her hands, resting them gently in her lap. The Pope approached. No entourage, no formal blessing, just a man who had once wept in a balcony, listening to a child play in the dark. He bowed his head. "I came not to speak," he said softly, "but to listen again." Lucia smiled. "And did you hear what I meant?" He nodded. "Yes, I heard the end of a question I didn't know I was asking." She turned her face toward the sound of the bells ringing in the distance. "There's more music," she whispered. "I don't know where it's coming from yet, but it's out there, in someone else, waiting to be played." The Pope placed his hand gently over hers. "Then let us make sure the world keeps listening." A week later, an announcement was made, not in press rooms, but during a homily. The Vatican would be funding a new global initiative, the Lucian Network of Sound and Sanctuary, a project aimed at bringing music education instruments and safe spaces to children in conflict zones, refugee camps, and orphanages around the world. It would not just be about performance. It would be about restoration. And at the center of it, guiding without commanding, teaching without titles, was Lucia. Her name now meant something, not because of power, but because it reminded people that grace could wear torn shoes and still stand in holy places. Months passed, then a year. Lucia continued to play in quiet rooms and sunlit chapels. She refused television interviews, she turned down awards. She donated every dollar earned from her recordings to building more pianos in places where silence had lingered too long. But she never forgot the first rejection, the first laugh, the first time a man in robes told her she didn't belong. She did not carry it with bitterness. She carried it like a stone in her pocket, not to throw, but to remind herself of how far grace had carried her beyond it. And one evening, as she sat once more beneath the open sky, she turned to the children beside her and said, "Do you want to hear the first song I ever tried to play?" They all nodded eagerly. Lucia smiled. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her clouded eyes, and whispered, "It wasn't very good, but it was mine." And then she began. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And as the children leaned in to listen and the stars began to blink alive above them, the world spun gently beneath their feet. Not as a stage, not as a battlefield, but as a concert hall waiting to echo with something human. The seasons turned once more. The gardens of Rome bloomed and faded and bloomed again as they always had, unaware that the world beyond their iron gates had been changed by the quiet hands of a girl who never sought applause, only honesty. Lucia remained where she had always been, close to the piano, close to the soil, close to the children who still tugged her hands and whispered their dreams into her ear. Her fame never lived in headlines. It lived in hushed lullabies and letters scribbled in crayons. It lived in broken countries slowly remembering music. And then one day, the Vatican sent a letter, not a summons, but an invitation. A final celebration was to be held in her honor. Not a ceremony, not a concert, a gathering. A thank you from the church, from the world, and from those whose lives had been softened by the sound of her heart. At first, Lucia hesitated. She had never loved grand halls or stages. But Sister Maria took her hand and said, "It's not for you, it's for them. So they remember that gentleness can change everything." So she agreed. The event was set in the courtyard of the Apostolic Palace. No roof above, no marble beneath, just earth and sky and wind. Children from every country Lucia had touched were flown in. Many had never boarded a plane before. Some came still carrying trauma. Others brought only songs they'd written in her name. A stage was built, but it wasn't elevated. It was low, like a garden bench. Beside it stood the piano, the same one she'd played in the ruins, restored by hand, with the dents left intentionally, like scars you learn to love. Lucia arrived in white, not because it was expected, but because it felt like light. As she was led to the piano, the children rose to their feet, not because someone told them to, but because they knew instinctively what reverence looked like. The Pope himself stood among them, no throne behind him, no golden staff in hand. Just a man of faith watching a miracle made of flesh and sound. Lucia sat, her hands paused above the keys, and she whispered, "This one's for everyone who didn't think they belonged." She began with silence, as she always did, but what followed was different. It wasn't a lullaby, it wasn't a lament, it was joy, pure, imperfect, unapologetic joy, the kind that makes feet tap without permission, the kind that cracks open chests and makes old men cry like children, the kind that tells the world, "You have suffered, but you are still here. You are still music." As she played, the children began to rise from their seats, not to leave, but to dance. First in twos, then in threes, until the courtyard was filled with spinning, laughing, barefoot life. Even some of the cardinals swayed gently, hands over hearts, eyes shining. Maria wept openly. The Pope watched with a soft, trembling smile, his head bowed, not in authority, but in awe. And then, Lucia stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically. She simply lifted her hands, and the music folded itself back into silence like a prayer finally complete. The courtyard held still, no applause, just breath. The Pope stepped forward. He did not speak at a microphone. He did not read from a page. He knelt, right there, on the earth, before her, and said, "You did not just play music. You retuned the soul of the Church." Lucia tilted her head, listening to the weight in his words. "Too long have we silenced those who play differently," he said. "Too long have we mistaken spectacle for spirit. You reminded us what holy sounds like." Lucia reached out, not to bless, not to perform, but to take his hand. And with the crowd gathered around, he whispered the words the world would soon carry in every language. "You are not just a gift from heaven, child. You are proof that heaven is listening." That evening, as the sun began to set in streaks of gold and lavender, the children were given candles, and one by one they lit them and placed them around the stage until the piano glowed like a beacon. And then they sang. Not a song from a hymnal, not a song from any official canon. They sang Lucia's melody, the one she had played in the ruins, the one that began as sorrow and grew into survival. Dozens of voices, different languages, different harmonies. One song. The girl who once sat in silence now heard her music played back to her not from speakers, but from souls. She closed her eyes, tilted her face to the fading sky, and smiled. She didn't need to play again. Her song had already been given away, and now it lived in them. Months later, the chapel where she had first been mocked, where Maestro Bellini had struck his baton and called her broken, was transformed. Not demolished. Transformed. The marble floor was left as it was, but the altar was replaced with a round space filled with light and instruments. No pews, just cushions, open air, and the words inscribed on the wall. She could not see the notes, but she taught us how to listen. No name, no plaque, just the echo, just the legacy. Lucia remained with the children until her final days, not sick, not fading, simply still. Her hair turned silver, her hands slowed, but her spirit never quieted. And when the time came, she passed not in a hospital, but beside the piano, with her fingers resting gently on its edge, and her head tilted as though still listening to a melody only she could hear. The children who loved her wept, but they did not despair, because she had taught them something most people never learn, that music is not made of notes. It is made of presence. And those who listen, truly listen, can never be alone again. So now, if you walk through Rome at dusk, and you listen carefully in the wind, you may still hear it, not with your ears, but with the part of you that remembers being small, the part of you that still waits to be heard, a melody, a whisper, a girl who once played for no one and changed the world. Sometimes, the most powerful voices come from those who have been silenced the longest. Lucia didn't need sight to see the world's wounds. She only needed to listen. Her journey reminds us that we are not defined by the limitations others place on us, but by the quiet courage we carry in the face of rejection. She was mocked, dismissed, and pushed aside. Yet she chose music over bitterness, grace over resentment. In doing so, she healed hearts across continents, not with power, but with presence. She taught us that beauty doesn't demand permission, and that the most broken places often echo the loudest with hope. No matter who you are, no matter what you've endured, your voice matters. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need a stage. You just need to speak your truth in whatever language your soul understands, be it words, art, kindness, or silence. Lucia's music wasn't loud, but it moved the world. And maybe, just maybe, so can yours.